Your history is full of battles, killing, and bloodshed. So, you're telling us that a nation whose political history is free of wars and bloodshed wouldn't find it pleasant to respond to you? Because history is the history of conflicts, the history of struggles in any nation. So, you Muslims haven't contributed anything to the scientific and humanistic movement. You feel like we're just adding to the problem. The greatest thing Muslims added to human civilization is their religion and morals. How do we differentiate between history and civilization? People who have morals but no luxurious buildings, nobody notices, nobody calls them civilized or a civilization. When you tell it from your perspective as a Muslim, you feel it's a mistake. What about people who have material wealth but no morals? In short, when they took our sciences, many of them attributed our sciences to themselves, as if it's permissible for them but forbidden for you to tell this story. It's like you can't say sunrise or sunset is good or bad. Music, that's it. Episode 4 of the 100 Questions. In History series, what distinguishes this episode is that we will enter the second axis of this series. Professor Muhammad, welcome. Professor Muhammad Al-Harmi, of course, the constant and permanent guest in this blessed and wonderful series. We will begin in the world of Islamic civilization, which you surely love. And we will now present question number 11. Question number 11 is also one of the things that has a bit of a debate about it. And I should mention, of course, that in this series we always present the pressing questions that qualify us to enter the world of history safely, calmly, and peacefully into the world of our vast Islamic history. I tell you that in the year 178, the Battle of the Storehouses, also known as the Battle of the Three Kings, took place, blah blah blah. So you say to me, okay, fine, you are talking about history. Then I say to you, for example, that Al-Azhar is distinguished in its architecture by such, and you say to me, oh, wait a minute, you are talking about civilization. Stop talking about history. So we have a problem, yes, which is how we differentiate between history and civilization. There is some confusion surrounding this topic. Yes, in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, and peace and blessings be upon the messenger of God, his family, his companions, and those who follow him. What is the difference between history and civilization? Civilization is the Arabic translation of the English word civilization, and sometimes it is translated as civilization. So, the words civilization and civilization are essentially the same, but in recent decades, the translation has become civilization. The origin of the word civilization in Arabic is the word al-hadar, urban. You know, people are divided into Bedouin and urban. Urban dwellers are the people who live in cities, while Bedouin are the people who live in the desert or the outskirts. Al-Mutanabi has a verse that says, people are for people, Bedouin and urban, some serving others, even if they don't intend to. So, the division is between Bedouin and urban. The word civilization originally expresses progress from Bedouin life. Of course, I disagree with the idea of progressing from Bedouin life. It's as if Bedouin life is the first life in its simplest form, as Ibn Khaldun says. Ibn Khaldun, at the beginning of his Muqaddimah, differentiates between Bedouin and urban people, saying that a Bedouin person's life is one thing. Simply put, a Bedouin is self-sufficient. He knows how to cook for himself, make his own drinks, work independently, and defend himself. He manages all his affairs. Meanwhile, urban dwellers find themselves in a broader environment, leading to specialization. The baker makes his bread, the farmer provides the harvest, and the cheesemaker provides the food. Protection is also provided by the Sultan, the police, and the garrison. The Bedouin, on the other hand, has a single, specialized job, whether he's a craftsman or a tradesman. His life becomes dependent on others. Unlike the Bedouin, who is self-reliant, the urban dweller is the one who has settled in the city, where work has multiplied, specialization has developed, and people rely on one Another, that's the linguistic difference. But what? Say, when does history end and civilization begin? Or when does civilization end and history begin? Every person has a history, but not everyone. Human beings have civilizations. Every people has a history, but not every people has a civilization. Civilization, in general, is used to refer to major nations and societies and how they have managed their lives. Some people, some historians, some philosophers say that civilization is the cultural and material system. Some people say no, it's only the cultural system, and some people say only the material system. What does that mean? For example, if I'm in a society like Egyptian, Palestinian, Syrian, or Iraqi society, or any other, someone might say that civilization means studying the culture of the people, how they organize their lives, their customs, traditions, manners, morals, and arts. The cultural system, the non-material system, the moral system. Some people say no, civilization is the material system. For example, the first group, those who focus on the cultural system, are talking about manners, traditions, morals, and the system of administration. But the materialists are talking about the arts, architecture, roads, factories, material production, not just cultural and intangible production. And some people like to combine the two, saying that civilization is a mixture of the cultural and material aspects together, because material products cannot exist without a cultural background, and if that cultural background didn't produce a material system, then we wouldn't see it, it wouldn't endure, we wouldn't know it, it would remain like customs, traditions, and myths in people's minds, unseen and unappreciated. Anyway, this distinction doesn't concern us much. What matters to us as people who want to know history in general is that the word civilization usually refers to achievements, and the word history refers to history, both the good and the bad. Often, when someone uses the word civilization, they're praising it, saying things like, this is something good, or this is a civilized person. By civilized, they mean inhabited, civilized, a kind of praise. Of course, because we are currently living under Western hegemony, the word civilization often refers to material achievement. People who have morals but don't have luxurious buildings are ignored. No one calls them civilized or cultured. But what about people who have material possessions? They have no morals, yet they call themselves civilized. This is one of the consequences of our being under Western hegemony, and Western civilization is materialistic at its core. For example, someone like President Aliger Isvidovic, in his wonderful book Islam Between East and West, distinguished between culture and civilization. He said that culture is the influence of humanity on morality, while civilization is the influence of intellect on the world. So, if someone asks you what the difference is between history and cultural history, they often mean that cultural history is the study of systems, administration, arts, literature, things that are generally good. But what about history? History has its ups and downs. Often, when someone says this is history, they mean it's bad, and this is civilization, they mean it's good. In any case, the reader, the one who wants to read, must understand the writer's concept of civilization in order to grasp the meaning they intend when using the term, which encompasses the Other, history encompasses civilization. History encompasses civilization. It encompasses civilization because history is broader and more general than civilization. Yes, when you say Islamic history, it includes Islamic civilization. But when you say Islamic civilization, it doesn't necessarily include Islamic history. Someone can write about Islamic civilization without addressing political history, for example. But if someone writes about Islamic history without mentioning, for example, political Islamic history, they should include aspects of Islamic civilization within it. It will be one of the main themes. Yes, when I talk, I will talk about our Islamic civilization, or what I mean is that I want to talk about architecture, urban development, scientific advancements, and aspects related to culture, poetry, language, and its sciences. All of this constitutes Islamic civilization, not just architecture. No, all of it constitutes Islamic civilization. Architecture is just one aspect of civilization, while civilization, as I told you, includes even intangible things like the system of governance. The system of governance is not something tangible and material. Culture is not something tangible and material. Morality, this isn't something tangible and material. Traditions aren't something tangible and material. This is in addition to poetry, music, arts, drawings, architecture, and the way people deal with legal matters, the judicial system. All of this falls within the context of civilization. Books, writings, sciences, pure sciences, and sciences, all of this is within civilization. So, to summarize the question, to differentiate between civilization and history, what do we usually say? Those who refer to civilization often mean its bright side, while those who refer to history often mean its darker side. Mostly, yes, but people differ in their use of the two terms. To understand the author's or speaker's intention, you need to understand what they mean, how they view history, and how they view civilization. Now, let's move on to question number 12 in this blessed series. My brother, you Muslims, your history is full of knowledge, killing, and bloodshed. Your history is nothing but these stories. If you want to talk about history, you only find battles, killing, slaughter, conquests, and so on. How do we get rid of this story? Yes, how? Look, it's good that you asked this question after the previous one. That's right. History is usually divided into political history and cultural history. What is political history? Political history is what follows the news of kings, princes, sultans, and ministers. Therefore, it's a history of conflicts, disputes, wars, conspiracies. So-and-so overthrew so-and-so, so-and-so deposed so-and-so, so-and-so had a revolution against so-and-so, so-and-so expanded, so-and-so was defeated, so-and-so triumphed. That's political history. Therefore, political history is always in any nation, the worst chapter of its history because it's a history of conflicts. Okay, but let's focus on in any nation. Now, if I wanted to describe any country, if I were to talk about Britain, I'd talk about France, I'd talk about America, I'd talk about Russia. If I were to write the political history of France, I'd write about the Napoleonic Wars, then World War I, then World War Roman II and its decline in global influence, and then I'd talk about Charles de Gaulle and about Napoleon and Napoleon Roman III and the Vichy government. So all I'm going to mention about French political history is wars, conflicts, and struggles. The same goes for British history. But when I talk about cultural history, names like Voltaire, Jean-Paul Gros, and Montesquieu, the philosophers of the Enlightenment, come up. You find yourself faced with novels, plays, scientific works, inventions, and discoveries. So, if you want to love a nation, read its cultural history. If you want to hate a nation, read its political history. This is well known. That's why, for example, when the West, I mean Westerners, or those influenced by the West, try to draw attention to themselves or the West, they present cultural history saying, we have great philosophers, You'll find, for example, in our troubled Arab world, that most of those influenced by the West know the names of philosophers and thinkers better than the names of presidents and military leaders, because that's the bright side. But if you look at the political side, it's always the dark side. It's like entering a hospital, or when someone tells you that if you enter any city and the first thing you see is the hospital, you'll feel like the whole city is full of sick people. If the first thing you see in the city is the hospital, then the wars and conflicts. This is true for any nation, but the civilizational state is always the bright one, talking about sciences, inventions, discoveries, medicine, pharmacy, engineering, botany, astronomy, veterinary medicine, systems, literature, the judiciary, administration, arts, architecture, music, poetry. All these are bright matters containing human creativity that is not mixed with blood, conflict, and strife. So now, for example, the brother who asks this question says, your history is full of wars and bloodshed. Well, if we asked him, could he come up with a nation whose political history is free of wars and bloodshed, he wouldn't find one. It doesn't exist, yet he's asking this question in the period we are in as an Islamic nation. We are the oppressed nation that doesn't fight, but rather fights and kills in its own lands, and conflicts have erupted within it. Why the massacres? This is the effect of psychological defeat, the dominance of the prevailing culture, the dominant culture, as Sheikh Ibrahim al-Sakran, may God release him from captivity, calls it. The West now has military bases, and America has military bases spread all over the world. Yet, when he talks about America, he tells you, look, they have industry, they have education, they have development, they have inventions, and so on. And yet, at this very moment, they are engaged in killing, slaughter, and domination all over the world. As for the Muslims, who are being slaughtered in their own lands, he tells you, your history is full of conflicts. Generally speaking, the history of every nation is replete with conflicts. So, Professor Muhammad, we're not being unfair, are we? The question is clear. It might be that when we, especially those of us working in history, want to become martyrs, or study, or stand on the pulpit and plan, or give sermons, or stand at a funeral, or speak about something, when we want to become martyrs, all we find are battles and wars, and so on. In the subconscious mind, my brother, he turns his head right and sees battles in front of him. He turns this way and sees slaughter. So he starts to wonder, is the problem with us that we are the ones who exported this to people, or is it not? That's true, but I want to tell you why we are intensifying. We are a defeated nation, a weak nation. Now, when you are in a restaurant, do you order food, or do you order or do you order clothes, or do you order food delivery? When you find yourself in a weakened nation, and you see the saying of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, if you engage in usury, are content with agriculture, follow the tails of cattle, and abandon jihad, Allah will inflict upon you a humiliation that he will not remove from you until you return to your religion. Then you, right now, when you are sitting, at this very moment when I am talking to you, there is a massacre in Gaza, a massacre in Sudan, a massacre in Syria, and in the Far East, the Rohingya. I was just talking to a friend who is a Rohingya, and he sent me a message about the Rohingya tragedy. Of course, the Rohingya, who are in Arakan, are being targeted by both the official Burmese army and the Arakan Liberation Army militias. Both groups are attempting to recruit Muslims into their ranks. Those Muslims who don't join are either forced to enlist, killed, or displaced. When I find myself surrounded by this news, the first thing I need to remember from history, the first thing I need to examine in history, is our own journey, our journey of battles and conquests. But I must reiterate that the issue of wars, conflicts, and bloodshed, is it inherently right or wrong? This is what we should be discussing, because if you are faced with a human phenomenon, you can't simply say that sunrise or sunset is good or bad when you are faced with a human phenomenon that exists in all nations, then the existence of this phenomenon itself is not what determines right or wrong. Rather, it is how people act within it that makes it right or wrong. Therefore, was this war intended to transform people's lives for the better? Was it to bring people out of darkness into light? Was it to lift injustice from people? If so, then this war is a noble war. Like anyone in their homeland remembers the war of independence, the war of liberation, and people remember their reverence. You don't see that they committed a crime. So, if you went to anyone in Egypt and told them the 1973 war was a bloody and devastating war and asked them, what does this war mean? What's your stance on it? Do you see it as a just war and that those who died were martyrs defending the nation's independence? Then we would understand that war itself isn't inherently bad. It only becomes bad when it's unjust, when it's aggression, when it's oppression and tyranny. So, when I differentiate between nations or try to compare them, I should ask these people when they fought, were they fighting for a just cause or for a false one? What prevailed? What were their morals in war? Did they have no qualms about committing massacres of women, children, and non-combatants, demolishing homes on top of civilians, or were they committed to morals in war? If you find that some nations adhere to the morals of war, and you find that others don't adhere to the ethics of war, should I equate this with that simply because both fought? I'm telling you, the issue is this: look at the political history of any nation. It's a history of wars, conflicts, and disputes. The cultural history of any nation, on the other hand, is its bright side, the side of creativity and innovation. So, if you want to compare, for example, if someone wants to compare the Islamic nation or Islamic civilization with any other civilization, they have two options: compare the political history of the two nations or compare the cultural history of the two nations. But the big mistake they often make, without realizing it, is comparing the political history of one nation with the cultural history of another. This is what produces a distorted image. But look at any nation that has managed to maintain its strength, status, and superiority. It must have a force capable of protecting it. As Abu Tamim said, the sword is more truthful than books. Its edge is the dividing line between seriousness and jest. And he said, I answered him with a sword's edge, listening attentively. And if I had answered with something other than the sword, the world doesn't understand anything but the language of force, or as Shorky says, tell the one who says a kingdom is built on battalions. There is no kingdom, no civilization built on books, but on cultural creativity, art, and the passage of time. Cultural history emerges after political history has taken hold. In reality, all human achievement and creativity is indebted to warriors and fighters. If there hadn't been stability, if there hadn't been a period of security and prosperity, these inventions, innovations, arts, and literature wouldn't have come about. So, if I were to decide, if I wanted to decide, now you're telling me that pulpits are constantly talking about wars. Let me differentiate between two things: the preacher and the reformer. The preacher who ascends the pulpit to try to refine people's morals will find what he seeks more in cultural history than in political history. But the reformer who wants to learn from history to reform and change reality will find what he seeks more in political history than in cultural history. Political history is the essence, the core, the essence of history's lessons. It's the engine that drives Civilizational history. You understand the laws of history more from political history than from civilizational history. Civilizational history is useful in stages of advancement and renaissance, and in ethics, literature, sciences, and arts. But to learn how to understand conflict, how to wage conflict, how to win conflict, how to move from weakness to strength, how to maintain strength and avoid collapse, all these lessons are found in political history, which is often perceived negatively. Let me conclude this question with a small comment related to the way some people comment. They may feel like it's permissible for them to cite examples of battles and wars and so on, while it's forbidden for you to tell these stories, because when you, as a Muslim, tell them, it feels like a mistake, a sin, that you're talking about such things. You know, my friend, talking about conquests, there's no such thing as conquests. These are called occupation and colonialism, just like. Other than that, let's leave it at that. Look, let me tell you something. Let me give a simple example to clarify the picture. Let's imagine that America, which is the current global superpower, was truly committed to the principles it proclaims, the principles of human rights and the freedom of peoples, and used its power to remove tyrants and oppressors. For example, if a revolution occurred or a tyrannical ruler came to power, and America used its strength, soldiers, and money to remove that ruler and grant that people the right to self-determination and human rights as they see fit, then you would see that America performed a noble humanitarian act, instead of interfering in the affairs of others and committing an unjust and evil act. You would see it as performing a noble humanitarian act. When the strong rescue the weak from the oppressor, that is a noble humanitarian act, praised in every way. What many people don't realize is that the Islamic conquests were the most extensive movement to save humanity and remove tyranny. And if we remove tyrants now, for example, we're talking about 2024, during the Syrian Revolution, how many people inside and outside Syria wished that American forces could impose curfews on certain areas so that people wouldn't be targeted by Syrian airstrikes? Many. And if America had done that, remember when Obama threatened that any use of chemical weapons would lead to intervention? Well, Bashar al-Assad used chemical weapons, yet no one intervened. I mean, would American intervention at that time have been morally and humanely acceptable? It would have been. We hope that every person who has the power, or every nation and civilization that has the power, will use it to uphold these universal ethics. But what's happening in our world now is that they are truly hypocrites, and we see it in what's happening in Darza. They are hypocrites. They change their colors and talk about human rights while their weapons are given to murderers and butchers. The mere existence of wars and conflicts in the history of any nation doesn't allow you to say that it's something good or something bad, right or wrong. No, it's how this power was used. Did it adhere to principles? Adherence to ethics is what determines whether wars are honorable and noble or evil. Yes, God willing, we will explain, of course, the vast difference between the Muslim nation when it mobilizes and other nations when they mobilize. Indeed, if we look at the time of the conquests, God willing, the difference between the Muslim nation when it triumphs and other nations when they triumph is significant. Now, let's move on to the 13th question. Anyone who looks at Islamic history, Professor Muhammad, will find that we focused on religious sciences more than the humanities and applied sciences. We focused on jurisprudence, exegesis, the principles of jurisprudence, and theology more than we focused on philosophy and other applied sciences like physics, chemistry, and mathematics. Is this statement correct? If so, why? Firstly, this statement is Incorrect, but I can understand what brought this statement to the minds of some questioners. First, let's differentiate between religious sciences, humanities, and pure sciences. Let's consider ourselves facing three directions. Religious sciences are the sciences that aim to serve Islamic law, meaning jurisprudence, exegesis, hadith, grammar, and morphology. What are called the sciences of the divine, which are the sciences. The path to understanding Quranic and prophetic texts leads to the study of Islamic sciences. We will naturally focus on these because we are Muslims and want to know how to pray, how to fast, how to buy and sell, how to fight, and how to ask questions. So, focusing on it exists as separate disciplines in the way we understand them today. They were intertwined with other fields. There was no such thing as economics, history, sociology, or psychology. This classification is a modern, contemporary one, reflecting the expansion of knowledge and its fields. Before, these disciplines were either considered Islamic sciences or mixed with pure sciences. For example, philosophy was often intertwined with medicine. Doctors were often philosophers, like Hippocrates and others. I mean Galen and Aristotle, the people who pioneered medicine, and others who wrote about medicine and philosophy. Medicine and philosophy were intertwined, and that's why you'll find that even prominent philosophers in Islamic civilization were physicians. For example, Ibn Sina, known as the Prince of Physicians, wrote the Book of Healing on Medicine, and he was also known for his philosophy. Those who sought medical books or knowledge of medicine among ancient civilizations, meaning when Islamic civilization began translating books, didn't find medicine and philosophy in two separate books. Instead, they were combined in one book. This shows that the sciences were intertwined. The physician tried to understand the cause of illness through logical reasoning and to determine how to treat it through intellectual reasoning. Philosophy for
كان مختلط بالسحر اللي هو ان المادة تقرأ عليها طلاسم او تحاول فهم اسرارها فتتحكم فيها. كل ده كان واحد. المسلمين هم اللي فصلوا بينهم بعدين.
Example was intertwined with
مثلا الفلك كان مختلط بالتنجيم. انك تدرس الفلك وحركة النجوم.
Astronomy. You studied astronomy, the movement of stars and planets, and tried to predict when eclipses would occur. This study was intertwined with observing the stars, meaning you tried to predict events on Earth based on their movements. Of course, science, the first science, astronomy, is required, but the second is forbidden, just as chemistry is required, but magic is forbidden, just as medicine is required, but philosophy in this pagan style is forbidden. However, when Muslims began translating these books and adopting the heritage of previous nations, a mixing occurred. There was indeed a mixing between these fields. One of the most important achievements of Islamic civilization, which we can certainly address in a future question, is that they established experimental science. This means, no, we're not going to build and discover sciences through logical and geometric constructions and calculations on paper. Let's test them experimentally. This experimental science was laid down by Muslims. Westerners later attribute it to Roger Bacon and Francis Bacon, while the origin of this foundation of experimental science was with the Muslims. Therefore, Muslims were able to correct theories in medicine, theories in astronomy, and theories
حسابات
in engineering that were based on mental
فبالتالي اللي هيجي يعني من
and logical calculations. Consequently, anyone who comes along any contemporary and tries to examine, for example, the Islamic heritage will generally feel this: he was more interested in Islamic sciences than in pure sciences for several reasons. A first reason, as I mentioned earlier, is that the sciences were mixed. The second reason is that some of these mixed sciences were rejected by Islam, as I told you, such as philosophy, astrology, and magic. Even, for example, water extraction. Extracting water from the earth was mixed with magic because there's a difference between trying to understand science nearby and extracting it and using incantations on the ground to make it respond and water spring forth. These things were also mixed together, so I'm talking about something called the mixing of sciences. The second reason is that some of these sciences, the humanities, such as history, economics, and sociology, were included within chapters of jurisprudence. So, when you open a book of jurisprudence, or a book on Islamic political theory, or a book on spiritual refinement, these contain the essence of Muslim social sciences, but because they weren't clearly separated, they were it falls under other headings, meaning, for example, the essence of historical patterns and their characteristics is found in books on Islamic political theory. When someone advises a king and offers him counsel or presents a political program, he mentions the just kings and how they fared, the unjust kings and what happened to them, how the people should be governed, how to protect the army, and how to treat the people well. So, the essence of something like
زبدة العلم الاقتصادي قد تجده في كتب البيوع الفقهية أو كتب الخراج.
Abu Yusuf al-Qadi, when he wrote the book on land tax for Harun al-Rashid, was in reality laying out an economic program for him, outlining how the kingdom could be managed economically. He included verses from the Quran, hadiths, the actions of the Prophet, the actions of Abu Bakr and Umar, the rightly guided caliphs, and the words of scholars. So, this isn't just a book on land tax. If someone saw it in the index, they wouldn't understand that it's about economics, or something like psychology and education. You'll find it in books on spiritual refinement, like Ihya Ulum al-Din, the revival of religious sciences. No one among our contemporaries realizes that Ihya Ulum al-Din is one of the most profound books on understanding psychology, education, and preaching. Therefore, the modern reader gets confused by the many sciences that Muslims excelled in it, and it is considered one of the religious sciences, but in reality, according to the modern classification, it belongs to the humanities. Another reason for this confusion is that most Muslim scholars in the humanities and pure sciences had a solid foundation in Islamic lore. For example, when you mention Ibn Khaldun, a contemporary might see him as a historian and sociologist, but someone who lived in Ibn Khaldun's time would see him as a Maliki jurist, since he was a Maliki jurist and judge. Someone might talk about al-Ghazali, but perhaps a contemporary, after discovering al-Ghazali's legacy, would see him as a philosopher and consider him an expert in psychology and education.
العلماء الذين كتبوا حتى في العلوم الإنسانية لهم تأسيسهم الشرعي الكبير، يعني الحسن بن الهيثم مثلا.
We know Ibn al-Haytham as the pioneer of optics, and we often overlook his strong foundation in Islamic law, his legal authority, and his other contributions. Therefore, one needs to be familiar with Islamic heritage before making the judgment that Islamic civilization focused more on religious sciences than pure sciences. This is incorrect. One must even. We know that the translation movement began in the Umayyad era. The translation of sciences began in the Umayyad era. Prince Khalid ibn Yazid ibn Muawiyah is well known for his work in this area. I recall, for example, Sheikh al-Salarbi in his book The Umayyad state. I don't recall the source he used, but when he wanted to investigate the number of doctors in the Umayyad era, he found statistics that did
جمع له 150 طبيب. يا الله. 150 طبيب في مدينة البصرة اللي كان عددها في ذلك الوقت
and exceed 80,000. It couldn't possibly have exceeded
لا يمكن أن يتجاوز 80,000. عدد ضخم طبعا.
800,000, a huge number.
نسبة السكان.
The ratio of doctors to the
عايز أقول لك لو قلنا مثلا أظن
population, let's say, for example,
360 طب دي نسبة لا
1 doctor per 350 or 360 people. This ratio is unprecedented, even in developed countries. You can't look at such a figure and conclude that Muslims were negligent in the medical or pure sciences. In fact, Islamic scholars stipulate that
إذا خلا من طبيب مسلم أثم أهله.
if a Muslim country lacks a Muslim doctor, its
إنه هذا أمر لا
people are considered sinful. This is a collective obligation because their lives cannot be properly managed without it, and it is impermissible for someone who is not a Muslim to be privy to the private matters of Muslims. Whether you're Muslim or not, I want to tell you that even from a religious perspective, and even from a religious standpoint, you must have doctors, engineers, and chemists. Of course, the Islamic civilization's focus was on pure sciences, applied sciences, and the humanities. The religious sciences were secondary to it. But, for these reasons I've mentioned, the modern observer doesn't notice the true division of this Islamic heritage. So, Professor Muhammad, when did we, as Muslims, begin to separate the branches? When did we start categorizing and saying that this is from the religious sciences, this is from the humanities, this is from the applied sciences? Of course, we started to differentiate the sciences from each other. So, when I open a book I'm reading now, yes, in medicine, I'm reading now about such and such, this doesn't happen by decree. It happens naturally with the expansion of knowledge. As soon as you find that knowledge branches out, scientific research forces you to divide it. This happens as you give to knowledge and as you write about it, its specializations begin to emerge. For example, in the past, medicine was simply medicine. The doctor knew how to examine you all over. But after a while, with the increase in knowledge, a person is no longer able to specialize in everything. So now there are people interested in chest and heart diseases, people interested in eyes, people interested in nerves, people interested in the digestive system, and people interested in bones. This happens with the advancement of science. But for example, something I will never forget, or rather, something that is found in the history of al-Tabari in the 3rd century, is that Muslims had specialized clinics. In al-Tabari's history, there is a remarkable story that hardly catches the attention of most people. It tells of a woman whose son joined the Carmatians. Then her son declared her an infidel, and she fled from him. Then he wounded her with a sword while she was looking for a place to be treated. They told her, no, by God, this is the ophthalmologist's shop. This is the man who specializes in ophthalmology. But wait until so-and-so comes. So, if people at that time, I have researched the locations of hospitals in Islamic civilization. When Muslims wanted to build hospitals, did they build on a plot of land, the empty space, and they didn't have standards? I was amazed and astonished that the hospital's location, of course, we all know the story of Abu Bakr al-Razi when he placed meat in more than one place. This wasn't just a one-off, and he wasn't just a doctor, it was a methodology. So, when you look at the locations of hospitals, you take each hospital that was built and try to find it in books of plans and cities, and you try to discover its location. You find the hospital located in the best location in the city, either next to the mosque, or in front of meadows of flowers, or in front of a river. Sometimes hospitals are built in a way that prevents animals, ants, and insects from entering. Muslims have wonderful and clever inventions in this regard, which we may come to in its proper context. But I want to tell you that there is a general mindset that managed these matters in a way that indicates the existing scientific progress. Yes, also, one of the research papers I wrote, which I am proud of, is research on the environmental standards for Islamic housing. Environmental standards for Islamic housing, and I was very surprised when I found master's theses and doctoral dissertations in engineering colleges in Cairo, Ain Shams, and others. I reached the point where, for example, when he studies the buildings of Old Cairo in terms of the ratio of light and shadow, and it becomes clear that the Islamic architects of 500 and 700 years ago achieved ratio global standards, the distribution of light and shadow, humidity and heat. These ratios have now reached international standards. These ratios existed, for example, in how a city's main street was built in a way that avoided the east-west winds, and how houses were sloping to provide a certain amount of humidity. There are details that become clearer as you delve deeper into water sources and Islam's approach to them. For example, fountains. One of the things Muslims have done in every old city is to avoid stagnant water. You'll find that one of the most important reasons is that Islamic jurisprudence. There are texts from the Prophet, peace be upon him, about not using stagnant water for ablution or for other purposes, so Muslims became very concerned about not having stagnant water in their environment, even in a basin. Water and a water basin. We build a fountain for it so that the water remains flowing, suitable for ablution and for other purposes. When you look at the Alhambra Palace in Granada and how water was brought to it, the Alhambra Palace is on top of Mount Surnivarder. How was there water brought there? And when there is a lot of water, how is it drained? There are many examples. I won't know how to list them all, but what I mean is that the presence of these practical applications is evidence of the existence of precise specializations at that time, even if there was a kind of knowledge gap that prevented us now from studying how these buildings were built in such a precise scientific manner. So, in short, we were extremely interested in all aspects. Religion as well as worldly matters. And this is something I would like to point out here, the beautiful explanation by Sheikh Muhammad Qurt, may God have mercy on him, in his book Glimpses from the Messenger. The first hadith is the hadith, let him plant it, which is the saying of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. If the hour comes and one of you has a sapling in his hand, and he is able to plant it before the hour comes, then let him plant it. If he is able to plant it before the hour comes, then let him plant it, for he will have a reward for that. Sheikh Muhammad Qurt means in his explanation of this hadith focused on the meaning that in Islam, worldly work is also work for the religion. Muslims do not separate worldly work from religious work. Striving for worldly gain, as long as the intention is good, is itself a religious act for which one is rewarded. That is why God, may he be blessed and exalted, said he created you from the earth and settled you therein, meaning he asked you to cultivate it. So, when Muslims worked to improve the world, they saw that in doing so they were fulfilling a religious purpose and a religious goal, something for which they would be rewarded on the Day of Judgment. Otherwise, if there were a separation between religion and worldly life, the most common situation in this hadith would be if the hour comes and one of you has a sapling in his hand, what should he do? He should leave it and go and pray 2 rak'ahs and say, Glory be to God, because the sapling will not bear fruit and no one will benefit from it. The fact that the most important deeds at the moment of the Day of Judgment are worldly deeds for those who were engaged in worldly work is evidence that worldly work is intended for the hereafter. This is why Muslims encourage it in this way. That is why you find weak hadiths, for example, regarding the virtues of Agriculture. Why would a liar or a fabricator invent a hadith about the virtues of agriculture? Because the general Islamic culture, which permeated society, held that agriculture is part of cultivating the land and seeking God's favor. Otherwise, have you ever seen someone fabricate a hadith unless it served a purpose or was unnecessary? If Muslims were an ascetic people detached from worldly affairs, and someone came along and told them a hadith about the virtues of agriculture, would that be useful? It's because Muslims were performing worldly tasks for the hereafter. That's why, as I am telling you, weak hadiths appeared about the virtues of worldly work. Okay, question 14. Of course, it's one of those claims that I find interesting to refute. We enjoy responding to such claims. Sir, you Muslims haven't contributed anything to the scientific and humanistic movement. Your ultimate goal is to simply copy Greek sciences faithfully and accurately as you have accustomed us to. You Muslims translated it, and that's what you contributed to this great human cultural heritage. So where are your sciences? What did you do for us? You feel like we're just an extra. Like we were just messengers. Look, what do you think? I'll answer part of this question and leave the main answer for the next episode because there won't be enough time. We Muslims were trustworthy messengers, a reliable vehicle that transported the heritage of the ancients to contemporary Western civilization. We were trustworthy, and when we transmitted it exactly as it was. We didn't add or subtract anything, and we attributed it to its rightful owners. We didn't falsify it or claim it as our own until others discovered it through us. A person who did this deserves praise, not criticism. I know, by God, a trustworthy person who delivered the trust he had to its rightful owner, not to the owner, of course, but to the next person exactly as it was, without adding to it or attributing it to himself. That's me. Should I call him Amin or not? Or should I call him Hafiz? That's why the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, even when dividing the ranks of virtue, said, my example and the example of what I have been sent with of knowledge, and he gave 3 examples, like land that receives rain and produces vegetation. That is, it produces crops, and people, animals, and livestock eat from it and benefit from it. The one who benefits most from the knowledge I have brought is the one who takes the knowledge, understands it, knows how to give rulings based on it, and knows how to extract from it what benefits people. So, people benefit from it, and some of it, meaning some of the land that received rain. The Prophet is now giving the example of the knowledge he brought, like rain, falling on different types of land. In fertile land, it produced vegetation and fruit, and animals came and ate and benefited. In another type of land, which retained the water, it wasn't fertile, but the land that retained the water made the rainwater available as a drinking resource, so people and livestock drank from it and benefited. It's true it didn't produce vegetation, but it retained it. So, did these benefit people or not? And the third type of land is barren land. Neither did they grow crops nor hold back rain. These people, what are they? They're useless. The rain came and passed them by, but they neither grew it nor held it for the people. So, I want to say that one of the levels of virtue is preserving what has been given to you. As the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, said, may God have mercy on a man who hears my words, understands them, and conveys them as he heard them. Perhaps a person who hears them will convey them, or perhaps a general listener will. I might have knowledge, but I don't have the talent to benefit from it. You know the story of al-Amash, whose memory didn't fail him. He was one of the scholars of Hadith. He said to Abu Yusuf al-Qadi, what is your opinion on such and such issue? He said, such and such. He said, and what is your proof? Where did you get this from? He said, from the hadith of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. He said, by God, I knew this hadith before you were even created in your mother's womb. But but the talent of the jurist in extracting knowledge wasn't with our friend, the memorizer of hadith, but glory be to God. Now I want to say, my friend, if the task were limited to preserving these sciences and this heritage, which would have disappeared without us, would have been transferred and we would have regretted starting from scratch again. My friend, if our role in this life, if we were the transmitters, would have been a great one, and beyond that, we have another merit. We didn't attribute it to ourselves, but rather gave it to them, attributing it to its rightful owners. This is unlike what the Westerners did. When they took our sciences, many of them attributed sciences that belonged to us to themselves. Then, with the existence of manuscripts and discoveries, we discovered that the laws of gravity, the laws of motion, and the pulmonary circulation were actually discoveries by Muslim scholars, so we also have a moral merit over them because we did and try to attribute these sciences to ourselves. Then, the question remains, did we truly add nothing to the scientific and civilizational movement? I will answer this as I told you in the next episode. But before we conclude this episode, I must draw attention to something. The greatest contribution of Muslims to human civilization is what they possess in terms of religion and ethics, not what they possess in terms of material achievements and physical sciences. How is it that the West discovered the atomic bomb? What did they do with it? They discover chemical weapons. What did they do with them? They destroyed humanity. What has the civilization that cloaked all its achievements in ethics done with the advancements in genetic engineering? This civilization saw this science as a means to God, not a tool for the deification of humanity, nor a means to exclude God, nor a tool for manipulating people, nor a tool for oppressing the weak. This ethical achievement of Islamic civilization is more precious and valuable than all they offered in the pure sciences. Now, when I talk about how Muslims managed sales and transactions and the use of chemistry, physics, and nature, you know, if Muslims had held supreme authority, the environmental problem wouldn't have arisen. I have a book on this that hasn't been published, a large research paper that hasn't been published, because the environmental problem couldn't have arisen within an Islamic context. My master's thesis was on the economics of resources in Islamic jurisprudence, showing how Islamic jurisprudence and Islamic civilization carefully balanced the issue of animal extinction and the issue of animal rights. In Islamic civilization, animals have 5 rights. Imagine 5 rights for animals. You don't even have to speak while riding an animal as long as I'm chatting. Get down. Don't use these animals as platforms. Don't you and your friend, each of you riding a donkey or horse, talking to each other. If you intend to talk and chat, get down. Don't tire the animal. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, said, regarding animal rights, the quality of offspring, he said, don't mate a horse with a donkey, even if you want a mule, which is better than a donkey, but don't mate a horse with a donkey. The Prophet forbade using birds as targets and inciting roosters to fight. He said, don't sit and watch 2 roosters fighting for your own personal pleasure, or bullfighting, for example. I'm talking to you about very, very, very delicate matters. And I mean amazing matters. By God, when I finished this research on animal rights in Islam, my faith increased. I increased my faith, so I'm telling you regarding what I'm saying to Muslims. Now, they have scientific superiority. A environmental problem couldn't have arisen because Islamic jurisprudence took into account certain things. There are many such things, and they fall within the context of scientific progress, including animal welfare, including the welfare of animals. For example, ancient Muslim scholars spoke about air pollution before it even existed in the world. So I want to say that the greatest achievement of Islamic civilization, its greatest contribution, is this spirit of faith and morality that permeated it. Even if they didn't add a single drop to material science, they framed
هو جزء من نعمة الله على
Material
الإنسان
science within this
من ثمار
framework,
الإنسان
telling you that it is part
والتطور
of God's blessings upon
الإنسان
humanity,
مهما
not
تعلم
part
من
of the
علوم
struggle
من
between
العلوم
humanity and
الدنيوية
God, as in the
والآخرة
West.
كلما
They
تعلم
believed
من
that no matter how
العلوم
much humanity
لا بد
learns, it
ألا
has
هو
only been given a
وصار
small portion of
سيطرة
knowledge,
وهيمنة
while the
على
Westerner
الواقع
believes that the more they learn, the more they displace
التفاصيل
God
التي
and
تتم
deify
مثلث
themselves,
الماء
becoming the
والهواء
masters and
والأرض
controllers of
ومظهر
nature.
الزرع
The details concerning water
ونتائج
and land
الاحتراق
pollution, preserving
مش
crops, and
موجود
protecting
في
animals
الحضارة
from
التي ليس
extinction, all
لها
of this is
مصدر ومرجع إلهي
absent in a civilization
لن
that lacks
يضيفها
a
إلا تغليف وبث كل
divine
الحضارات
source or
الحضارية
reference. If we
التي
had done
تتميز
nothing more than frame and
بهذه
disseminate all
الأخلاق الإنسانية
civilizational activity, scientific and
وهذه
otherwise, within
المعرفية
this ethical and humanistic
طبعا
framework,
لمن
it
يركز
would have
على
been
هذه
sufficient
الحضارات
and
الكبيرة
magnificent.
نتحدث
And
عن
of
الحضارة
course, this
العثمانية
is from those who this has been a focus lately for figures like Tahir Abul Rahman, the well-known Moroccan philosopher, and even someone like Whale Columbir. He says, I wish I had been a dhimmi during the Umayyad and Abbasid eras and not in my current situation as a university professor in America in the modern age. The ethical standards that encompassed human interaction and scientific production are not present in modernity. Modernity has made man a god, the powerful tyrants, and allowed them to exterminate people's dumb crops into the sea to prevent price drops, monopolize goods, and raise the prices of medicines. All these immoral and inhumane manifestations are a result of unchecked scientific progress. Now, let's discuss the issue of additions. Did Muslims truly not add anything? Let me, in the next episode, God willing, bring you some examples and citations, even from Western scholars themselves. What did Islamic civilization add to the world and to the scientific movement? With God's help, if we stop it. Question 14, which is in Episode 5, we will continue answering it, God willing. We are, of course, in the series 100 Questions in History, where we answer pressing and historically important questions. Until we meet again in the next episode, may God protect you. To watch more programs about Islamic history and to learn about its events, victories, defeats, leaders and scholars, its events and secrets, governance, politics, letters, and battles, all you have to do is follow our YouTube channel, Our History. Our history stretches from the furthest point in the past to the furthest point in the future.